Hi guys, this is Chapter 10, Master Stroke. The heat struck up like a blowtorch, so sharp and sudden that she gasped. She had sunstroke once up on the downs when she'd gone without a bonnet, and this was just like that. The world around here was in worrying shades of dull green. Yellow, purple, without shadows, the air was so full of heat that she felt she could squeeze smoke out of it. She was in reeds they looked like, and they were much taller than her, with sunflowers growing in them, except the sunflowers were white, because they weren't, in fact, sunflowers at all. They were daisies. She knew it. She stared at them dozens of times in that strange picture in the fairy tales book. They were daisies, and these weren't giant reeds around her. They were blades of grass, and she was very, very small. She was in that weird picture. This picture was the dream, or the dream was the picture. Which way around didn't matter, because she was right in the middle of it. If you fell off a cliff, it wouldn't matter if the ground was rushing up or you were rushing down. You were in trouble either way. Somewhere in the distance there was a loud crack and a ragged cheer. Someone clapped and said in a sleepy sort of voice, "Well done, good man, very well done." With some effort, Tiffany pushed her way between the blades of grass. And on a flat rock, a man was cracking nuts in half, as he was, with a two-handed hammer. He was being watched by a crowd of people. Now, Tiffany used the word people because she couldn't think of anything else that was suitable. But it was stretching the word a bit to make it fit all of those people. They were different sizes, for one thing. Some of the men were taller than her, even if you allowed for the fact that everyone was shorter than grass. But others were tiny. Some of them had faces you wouldn't look at twice, and others had faces you wouldn't want to look at once. This was a dream, after all, Tiffany told herself. It doesn't have to make sense or be nice. It's a dream, not a daydream. People who say things like, "May all your dreams come true," should try living in a dream for about 5 minutes. She stepped out into the bright, stiflingly hot clearing just as the man raised his hammer again and said, "Excuse me." "Yes," he said. "Is there a queen around here?" Tiffany asked. The man wiped his forehead and nodded toward the other side of the clearing. "Her Majesty is gone to her bower," he said. "That being a nook or a resting place?" guessed Tiffany. The man nodded and said, "Correct again, Miss Tiffany." "Don't ask how he knows your name," Tiffany told herself. "Thank you," she said, and because she had been brought up to be polite, she added, "Best of luck with your nut cracking." "Oh, this one's the toughest one yet," said the man. Tiffany walked off, trying to look as if this collection of strange, nearly people was just any other crowd. Possibly the scariest ones were the big women, and there were 2 of them. Big women were valued on the chalk. Farmers liked having big wives. Farm work was hard, and there was no call for a wife who couldn't carry a couple of piglets or a bale of hay. But these 2 could have carried 1 horse each. They stared haughtily at her as she walked past, and they had tiny, stupid little wings on their backs. "Nice day for watching nuts being cracked," said Tiffany cheerfully as she went past. Their huge, pale faces wrinkled, as if they were trying to work out what exactly she was. Sitting down near them, watching the nutcracker with an expression of concern, was a little man with a large head, a fringe of white beard, and pointy ears. He was wearing very old-fashioned clothes, and his eyes followed Tiffany wherever she went. "Good morning," she said. "Sneebs," he said, and in her head appeared the words, "Get away from here." "Excuse me?" she said. "Sneebs," said the man, wringing his hands, and then the words appeared, floating around in her brain. "It's terribly dangerous." He waved a pale hand as if to brush her away. Shaking her head, Tiffany walked on. There were lords and ladies, people in fine clothes, and even a few shepherds, but some of them had a pieced-together look. They looked, in fact, like a picture book that was back in her bedroom. It was made of thick card, its edges worn raggedy by generations of aching children. Each page showed a character, and each was cut into 4 strips that could be turned over independently. And the point of the whole thing was that a bored child could turn over parts of the pages and change the way that the characters were dressed. You could end up with a soldier's head on a baker's chest wearing a maid's dress and then a farmer's big boots. Tiffany had never been bored enough. She considered that even things that spend their whole lives hanging from the undersides of branches would never be bored enough to spend 5 seconds with that book. To the people around here, though, they looked that they'd either been taken from that book or had dressed for a fancy dress party in the dark. One or the 2 of them nodded at her as she passed, but didn't seem very surprised to see her. She ducked under a round leaf, much bigger than she was, and she took out the toad again. "What? It's so cold," said the toad, hunching down on her hand. "Cold? The air is baking." "There's just snow," said the toad. "Put me back. I'm freezing." "Just a minute," thought Tiffany. "Do toads dream?" she said. "No." "Oh, so it's not really hot?" "No. You just think it is." "Psst," said a voice. Tiffany put the toad away and wondered if she dared turn her head. "It's me," said the voice. Tiffany turned toward a clump of daisies twice the height of a man. "Yeah, that's not a lot of help," she said. "Are you crazy?" said one of the daisies. "I am looking for my brother," she said sharply. "You mean that horrible child who screams for candy all the time?" The daisy stems parted, and that boy Roland darted out and joined her under the leaf. "Yes," she said, edging away and feeling that only a sister has a right to call even a brother like Wentworth horrible. "Is he the one that threatens to go to the toilet if he's left alone?" he asked. "Yes, that's him. Where is he?" "That is your brother? That one who's permanently sticky?" "I told you this." "Wait, you really want him back?" "Yes." "Why?" "He's my brother," Tiffany thought. What does why have to do with it? "Because he's my brother. Now tell me, where is he?" "Are you sure you know how to get out of here?" asked Roland. "Of course," Tiffany lied. "And you can take me with you?" "Yes." Well, she hoped so anyway. "All right, I'll let you do that," said Roland, relaxing. "Oh, you'll let me, will you?" said Tiffany. "Look, I didn't know who you were, all right," said Roland. "There's always weird things around in the forest. Lost people, bits of dreams still lying around. You have to be careful. But if you really know the way, then I ought to get back before my father worries too much." Tiffany felt the second thoughts starting, and they said, "Don't change your expression. Just check." So, how long have you been here exactly?" she asked. "Well, the light doesn't really change very much," said the boy. "It feels like I've been here hours, maybe a day." Tiffany tried very hard not to let her face give anything away, but it just didn't work, and Roland's eyes narrowed. "Well, I have, haven't I?" he asked. "Oh, why do you ask?" said Tiffany desperately. "Because, in a way, it feels longer. I mean, I've only been hungry 2 or 3 times and been to twice. So it can't have been very long. But I've done all kinds of things. It's been a very busy day." His voice trailed off. No, you're right," said Tiffany. "Time goes by slowly here. It's been a bit longer." "What, like 100 years? Please don't tell me it's been 100 years. Something magical has happened and it's been 100 years, hasn't it?" "What?" No, just about 1 year. The boy's reaction was surprising, and this time he looked really frightened. Oh, that's worse than 100 years. How? Asked Tiffany, bewildered. If it was 100 years, I won't get a thrashing when I get home. Thought Tiffany. I don't think that's going to happen, she said. Your father's been very miserable. Besides, it's not your fault you were stolen by the Queen. And she hesitated, because this time it was his expression that gave it all away. Was it? Well, there was this fine lady on a horse with bells all over its harness, and she galloped past me when I was out hunting, and she was laughing. So, of course, I spurred my horse and chased after her. And he fell silent. That probably wasn't a very good decision, said Tiffany. It's not bad here, said Roland. It just keeps changing. There's doorways everywhere. You know, entrances to other places. And his voice tailed off. You'd better start at the beginning, said Tiffany. Well, it was great at first, said Roland. I thought it was, an adventure. She fed me sweetmeats. Wait, what are those exactly? Said Tiffany. Her dictionary hadn't included that one. Are they like sweetbreads? I don't know. What are sweetbreads? The pancreas or thymus gland of a cow, said Tiffany. It's not a very good name, I think. Roland's face went red with the effort of thought. These were more like nougat. Oh, right. Go on, said Tiffany. And then she told me to sing and dance and skip and play, said Roland. She told me that's what children were supposed to do. Did you? Would you? I felt like an idiot. I'm 12, Roland hesitated. In fact, if what you say is true, I guess I'm 13 right now. Why did she want you to skip and play? Said Tiffany, instead of saying, oh no, you're still 12 and you're acting like you're 8. She just said that's what children do, said Roland. Tiffany wondered about this. As far as she could see, children mostly just argued, shouted, ran around very fast, laughed loudly, picked their noses, got dirty, and sulked. And any dancing and skipping and singing, they had been probably stung by a wasp. That's strange, she said. And then when I wouldn't, she gave me more sweets. More nougat? Sugar plums, said Roland. They're like plums, but with sugar on them. She's always trying to feed me sugar. She thinks I like it. A small bell rang in Tiffany's memory. You don't think she's trying to fatten you up before she bakes you in her oven, do you? Of course not. Only wicked witches do that. Tiffany's eyes narrowed. Oh, yeah, I forgot, she said. So you've just been living on sweeties? No, I know how to hunt. Real animals get in here. I don't know how. Sneebs think that they find the doorway in by accident, and some of them just starve to death because it's always winter here. Sometimes the Queen sends out robbing parties if a door's open into an interesting world, too. This whole place is really like a pirate ship. Yeah, or a sheep tick, said Tiffany, thinking out loud. What are they? Well, they're insects that bite sheep, and they suck blood, and then they don't drop off until they're full, said Tiffany. Yuck. I suppose that's the sort of thing peasants have to know about, said Roland. I'm glad I don't. I've seen through doorways of 1 or 2 worlds. They wouldn't let me out, though. We got potatoes from one and fish from another. I think they just frighten people into giving them stuff. Oh, and there was this one world where the drones come from. They laughed about that and said if I wanted to go in there, then I was more than welcome. I didn't. It's all red like a sunset. Just a huge great sun on the horizon, and a red sea that hardly moves, and red rocks and long shadows. And there were these horrible creatures on the rocks. They lived off crabs and spidery things and little scribbity creatures. It was awful. There was this sort of little ring of claws and shells and bones around every single one of them. Who are they? Said Tiffany, who had noted the word peasants." "What do you mean?" "Well, you keep talking about they," said Tiffany. "Who do you mean? Like the people out there? Those?" "Most of them aren't even real," said Roland. "No, I mean the elves. The fairies. That's who she's queen of. Didn't you know?" "I thought they were small." "I think they can be any size they like," said Roland. "They're not exactly real. They're just like dreams of themselves. They can be as thin as air or solid as a rock. Sneeb says." "Sneebs," said Tiffany. "Oh, that little man who just says Sneebs, but then real words turn up in your head?" "Yeah, that's him. He's been here for years. That's how I knew about the time being wrong. Sneebs got back to his own world once, and it was just all different. He was so miserable, he found another doorway and came straight back." "Wait, he came back?" said Tiffany. "He said it was better to belong where you don't belong than to not belong where you do belong, remembering how you used to be when you used to belong there," said Roland. "Well, at least that's what I think he said. He said it's not too bad here if you just keep out of the Queen's way. He says you can learn a lot." Tiffany looked back at the hunched figure of Sneebs, who was still watching the nut cracking. He didn't look as though he was learning anything. He just looked like someone who'd been frightened for so long it had just become a part of his life, like freckles. "But you mustn't make the Queen angry," said Roland. "I've seen what happens to people who make her angry. She sets the bumblebee women on them." "Are you talking about those huge women with the tiny wings?" "Yes, and they're vicious. And if the Queen really gets angry with someone, she just stares at them, and they change." "Into what?" "Other things. I really don't want to have to draw you a picture." Roland shuddered. "And if I did, I'd need a lot of red and purple crayon. And then they get dragged off and they get left for the drones." And he shook his head. "Listen, dreams are real here. Really real. When you're inside them, you're not exactly here. And the nightmares are real. You can die." "Well, this doesn't feel very real," thought Tiffany. "This feels like a dream, almost like I could just wake up from it. I must always remember what is real." She looked down at her faded blue dress, with the bad stitching around the hem caused by it being let out and taken in as its various owners had grown. That was real. And she was real. Cheese was real, somewhere not far away in a world of green turf under a blue sky. And that was real. The Knack McFeagle were real, and once again she wished they were there. There was something about the way they shouted "Crivens!" and just attacked everything in sight. That was really very comforting. Roland was possibly real. Almost everything else was a dream, in a robber world that lived off of real worlds, and where time nearly stood still, and horrible things could happen at any moment. "I don't want to know anything more about it," she decided. "I just want to get my brother and go home while I'm still angry. Because when I stop being angry, that will be the time I get frightened again. And then I'll be really frightened this time. Too frightened to think. As frightened as Sneebs. I must think." "So the first dream I fell into was like one of mine," she said. "Now I've had dreams where I wake up and I'm still asleep. But this ballroom, I've never—" "Oh, that was one of mine," said Roland. "From when I was young. I woke up one night and I went down to the big hall and there were all these people with masks on dancing. It was just so bright." And he looked wistful for a moment. "That was when my mother was still alive." "This one's a picture from a book that I've gotten," said Tiffany. "So she must have gotten that one from me." "Oh, no, she often uses that one," said Roland. "She likes it. She picks up dreams from everywhere. She just collects them." Tiffany stood and picked up her frying pan again. "I'm going to see this Queen," she said. "Don't," said Roland. "You are the only other real person here except for Sneebs, and he is not really good company." "I'm getting my brother, and I'm going home," said Tiffany. "I'm not coming with you then," said Roland. I do not want to see what she turns you into." Tiffany stepped out into the heavy, shadowless light and followed the path up the slope. Giant grasses arched overhead, and here and there were more strangely dressed, strangely shaped people turning to watch her, and then they just acted as though she was just a passing wanderer of no interest any more. She glanced behind her. In the distance, the Nutcracker had found a bigger hammer, and he was getting ready to strike. "Wanna, sweetie!" Tiffany's head shot around like a weathercock in a tornado. She ran along the path, head down, ready to swing her pan at anything that stood in her way, and then she burst through a clump of grass into a space lined with daisies. It could well have been a bower. She didn't bother to check. There was Wentworth, sitting on a large flat stone, surrounded by sweets. Many of them were bigger than he was. Smaller ones were in piles, larger ones lay like logs. And they were in every single color a sweet could be, such as not really raspberry red, fake lemon yellow, curiously chemical orange, some kind of acidy green, and who knows what blue. Tears were falling off his chin in blobs. Since they were landing among the sweets, serious stickiness was already taking place. Wentworth howled. His mouth was a big red tunnel, with the wobbly thing that no one knows the name of bouncing around in the back of his throat. He stopped crying only when it was time to either breathe in or die, and even then it was only for one huge sucking moment that the howl came back again. Tiffany knew what the problem was immediately. She'd seen it before at birthday parties. Her brother was suffering from tragic, sweet deprivation. Yes, he was surrounded by sweets, but the moment he took any sweet at all and his sugar-addled brain, that meant he wasn't taking all the rest. And there were so many sweets he'd never be able to eat them all, and it was just too much to cope with. So the only solution was to burst into tears. The only solution at home was to put a bucket over his head until he calmed down, and to take almost all of the sweets away. He could deal with only a few handfuls at a time. Tiffany dropped the pan and swept him up in her arms. "It's Tiffy," she said. "We're going home." This is where I meet the Queen, she thought. But there was no scream of rage, no explosion of magic, nothing. There was just the buzz of bees in the distance, and the sound of wind in the grass, and the gulping of Wentworth, who was much too shocked to cry. She could see now that the far side of the bower contained a couch of leaves, surrounded by hanging flowers, but there was no one there. "That's because I'm behind you, my dear," said the voice of the Queen in her ear. Tiffany turned around quickly. There was no one there. "Still behind you," said the Queen. "This is my world, child. You'll never be as fast as me or as clever as me. Why are you trying to take my boy away?" "He isn't yours. He's ours," said Tiffany. "You never loved him. You have a heart like a little snowball. I can see it." Tiffany's forehead wrinkled. "Love?" she said. "What does that have to do with it? He's my brother. My brother." "Well, yes, now that's a very witchy thing, isn't it?" said the voice of the Queen. "Selfishness, mine, mine, mine. All a witch cares about is what's hers." "You stole him." "Stole? You mean you think you own him?" Tiffany's second thought said, "She's finding your weakness, so don't listen to her." "Oh, I see you have second thoughts," said the Queen. "I expect you think that makes you very witchy, don't you?" "Why won't you let me see you?" said Tiffany. "Are you frightened?" "Frightened?" said the voice of the Queen. "Of something like you?" And the Queen was there, in front of her. She was much taller than Tiffany, but just as slim. Her hair was long and black. Her face was pale, her lips cherry red, her dress black and white and red, and it was all very slightly wrong. Tiffany's second thought said, "It's because she's perfect. She's completely perfect, like a doll. Nobody real is perfect like that." "That isn't you," said Tiffany with complete certainty. "That's just your dream of you. That's not you at all." The Queen's smile disappeared for a moment and then came back edgy and brittle. "Such rudeness, and you hardly know me," she said, sitting down on a leafy seat, and she patted the square beside her. "Do sit down. Standing there is so confrontational. I will put your bad manners down to simple disorientation." And she gave Tiffany a beautiful smile. Look at the way her eyes move, thought Tiffany's second thoughts. I don't think she's using them to see you with. They're just beautiful ornaments. "You have invaded my home, killed some of my creatures, and generally acted in a very mean and despicable way," said the Queen, "and this offends me. However, I understand that you have been badly led to disruptive elements." "You stole my brother," said Tiffany, holding Wentworth tightly. "You steal all sorts of things." But her voice sounded weak and tinny in her own ears. "He was wandering around lost," said the Queen calmly. "I brought him home, and I comforted him." And what there was about the Queen's voice was this. It said in a very friendly, understanding way that she was right and you were wrong. And this wasn't your fault exactly. It was probably the fault of your parents or your food or something so terrible that you've completely forgotten about it. But it wasn't your fault. Now the Queen just understood because you were a nice person. It was just such a terrible thing that all these bad influences had led you to make the wrong choices. Now if only you would admit that, Tiffany, then the world would be a much happier place. This cold place guarded by monsters in a world where nothing grows older or up, said her second thoughts. A world with the Queen in charge of everything. Don't listen. She managed to take one step backward. "Am I a monster?" said the Queen. "All I wanted was a little bit of company." And Tiffany's second thoughts, quite swamped by the Queen's wonderful voice, said, "Miss Female Infant Robinson." She'd come to work as a maid at one of the farms many years ago, and they said that she'd been brought up in a home for the destitute in Yelp. They said she'd been born there after her mother arrived during a terrible storm, and the master had written in his big black diary, "To Miss Robinson, female infant." And her young mother hadn't been very bright, and she was dying in any case, and had thought that was the baby's name. After all, it had been written down in a very official book. Miss Robinson was quite old now. She never said much, never ate much, but you never saw her not doing something. No one could scrub a floor like Miss Female Infant Robinson. She had a thin, wispy face with a pointed red nose and thin, pale hands with red knuckles, which were always busy. Miss Robinson worked hard. Tiffany hadn't understood a lot of what was going on when the crime happened. The women talked about it in twos and threes at garden gates, their arms folded, and they'd stop and look indignant if a man walked past. She picked up little bits of conversation, though sometimes they seemed to be kind of like a code, like, "Never really had anyone in her own poor old soul. It wasn't her fault that she was skinnier than a rake." And "They say when they found her she was cuddling it and said it was hers." And "The house was full of baby clothes she knitted." Now that last one puzzled Tiffany at the time, because it was said in the same kind of voice that someone used to say, "And the house was full of human skulls." But they all agreed on one thing. We can't have this. A crime is a crime, and the Baron has to be told. Miss Robinson had stolen a baby. Punctuality Riddle, who had been much loved by his young parents even though they named him Punctuality, reasoning that if children could be named after other virtues like patience, faith, and prudence, what was wrong with good old-fashioned timekeeping? He'd been left in his crib in the yard and had vanished, and there had been all of the usual searchings and weepings, and then someone mentioned that Miss Robinson had been taking home extra milk. Well, it was kidnapping. There weren't many fences in the chalk, and very few doors had locks. Theft of all kinds of things was taken very seriously. Well, if you couldn't turn your back on what was yours for even 5 minutes, where would it all end? The law is the law, and a crime is a crime. Tiffany had overheard bits of arguments all over the village, but the same phrases cropped up over and over again. Poor thing meant no harm. She was a hard worker. She never complained. She's not quite right in the head, but the law's the law and a crime is a crime. And so the Baron was told, and he held a court in the great hall, and everyone who wasn't wanted up on the hills turned up, including Mr. and Mrs. Riddle, she looking worried, he looking determined, and Miss Robinson, who just stared at the ground, with her red-knuckled hands resting on her knees. It was hardly even a trial. Miss Robinson was confused about what she was accused of, and it seemed to Tiffany that so was everyone else. They weren't certain why they were all there, and they'd come to find out. The Baron had been quite uneasy, too. The law was clear. Theft was a dreadful crime, and stealing a human being was much worse. There was a prison in Yelp, right beside the home for the destitute. Some said there was even a connecting door, and that was where thieves went. The Baron wasn't exactly a big thinker. His family had held the chalk not by changing their mind about anything for hundreds of years. He sat and listened and drummed his fingers on the table, and he looked at people's faces, and he acted like a man sitting on a very hot chair. Tiffany was in the front row. She was there when the man started to give his verdict, umming and awing and trying not to say the words he knew he would have to say, when the door at the back of the hall opened, and the sheepdogs Thunder and Lightning trotted in. They came down the aisle between the rows of benches, and they sat down in front of the Baron, looking bright-eyed and alert. Only Tiffany craned to see back up the aisle. The doors were still slightly ajar. They were far too heavy even for a strong dog to push them open. She could just make out someone looking through the crack. The Baron stopped and stared, and he, too, looked at the other end of the hall. And then, after a few moments, he pushed the law book aside and said, "Perhaps we should do this a different way." And there was a different way, and it involved people paying a little more attention to Miss Robinson. It wasn't perfect, and not everyone was happy, but it worked. Tiffany smelled the scent of Jolly Sailor outside the hall when the meeting was over, and she thought about the Baron's dog. "Remember this day," her grandmother had said. "You'll have cause to." Sometimes barons needed reminding. "Who will speak up for you?" Tiffany asked aloud. "Speak up for me?" said the Queen, her fine eyebrows arching. And Tiffany's third thought said, "Watch her face when she's worried." "Well, there isn't anyone, is there?" said Tiffany, backing away. "Is there anyone you've been kind to? Anyone who will say you're not just a thief and a bully? Because that is what you are. You're like the drones. You've just got one trick." And there it was. Now she could see what her third thoughts had spotted. The Queen's face flickered for a moment. "And that isn't your body," said Tiffany, plunging on. "That's just what you want people to see. It's not real. It's just like everything else here. It's hollow and empty." And the Queen ran forward and slapped her, much harder than a dream should have been able to. Tiffany landed in the moss, and Wentworth rolled away, yelling, "Wanna go a toilet?" "Good," said Tiffany's third thoughts. "Good?" said Tiffany aloud. "Good?" said the Queen. "Yes," said Tiffany's third thoughts, "because she doesn't know you can have third thoughts, and your hand is only a few inches from the frying pan, and things like her hate iron, don't they? And she's angry. Now you make her furious so she can't think, and then you hurt her." "You just live here in a land full of winter, and all you do is dream about summer," said Tiffany. "No wonder the king went away." The Queen stood still for a moment, like a beautiful statue that she so resembled. And again the walking dream flickered, and Tiffany thought she saw something. It was not much bigger than her, and almost human, and a little shabby, and for just a moment it looked shocked. Then the Queen was back, tall and angry, and she drew a deep breath. And Tiffany grabbed the pan and she swung it as she rolled onto her feet. It hit the tall figure with a glancing blow, but the queen wavered like air on a hot road and screamed. Tiffany did not wait to see what else was going to happen. She grabbed her brother again and ran away, down through the grass, past the strange figures looking around at the queen's anger. Now shadows moved in the shadowless grasses. Some of the people, the joke people, the ones that looked like the flat book pages in the picture book, changed shape, and they started to move toward Tiffany and her screaming brother. There was a booming noise on the other side of the clearing, and the two huge creatures that Roland had called bumblebee women, they were raising off the ground, their tiny wings blurring with effort. Somebody grabbed her and pulled her into the grasses. It was Roland. "Can you get out now?" he demanded, his face red. Said Tiffany. "We'd better just run," he said. "Give me your hand. Come on." "Do you know a way out?" Tiffany panted as they dashed through giant daisies. "No," Roland panted back. "There isn't one. You saw the drones outside. This is a really strong dream." "Then why are we running?" To keep out of her way. If you hide long enough, Sneeb says she forgets." "Yeah, I don't think she's going to forget me that easily," Tiffany thought. Roland had stopped, but she pulled her hand away and ran onward, with Wentworth clinging to her in silent amazement. "Where are you going?" Roland shouted behind her. "I really want to keep out of her way." "Come back! You're running right back." "No, I'm not. I'm running in a straight line." "This is a dream," Roland shouted, but it was louder now because he was catching up to her. "You're running right around." Tiffany burst into a clearing. The clearing. The bumblebee women landed on either side of her, and the queen stepped forward. "You know," said the queen, "I really expected better of you, Tiffany. Now give me back that boy, and I shall decide what to do next." "It's not a big dream," mumbled Roland behind her. "If you go too far, you end up coming back." "I could make a dream for you that's even smaller than you are," said the queen pleasantly, "and that could be quite painful." The colors were brighter, sounds were louder, and Tiffany could smell something too. And what was strange about that was that up until now there had been no smells, and it was a sharp, bitter smell that you never forgot. It was the smell of snow, and underneath all the insect buzzings in the grass, she heard the very faintest of voices. "Crivens, I canna find a way out."